When you think of your favorite superhero, what's the first thing you think of? For me, it's easily Spider-Man. Since I was a small fetus, I was obsessed with Spider-Man. There's nothing more exciting to me than swinging through the city, punching criminals in the face, and wearing spandex. And I consumed a lot of Spider-Man content because of it. The Raimi films, Spectacular Spider-Man, Spider-Man the New Animated Series, Ultimate Spider-Man, the web movies. If it had Spider-Man in the title, I watched, played, collected, and wore it. So, naturally, I watched the MCU Spider-Man movies, and now that I'm old enough to actually make opinions about things, I'm going to do my best to dissect what exactly I don't like about the MCU Spider-Man, and maybe give my own preferred version of these films. So, first a bit of a disclaimer. I don't dislike the MCU Spider-Man movies. In fact, I think this is the best Spider-Man/Peter Parker we've ever had. But even though I think Homecoming and Far From Home are terrific movies, and I love Tom Holland's Spider-Man, Marvel has made some decisions that I think only hurt the character. Now that that is out of the way, let's get started. So the way I'm going to do this is just list off all the things I want to change, and then go into a little more detail about each one later. So, in no particular order, I would change no Iron Man/Tony Stark relationship, Peter would have money troubles, Spider-Man doesn't show up in Civil War, Uncle Ben is a character. Now that we know everything I'm going to be changing, it's time to go into a little more detail and lay out how I would implement all these changes, and what the movies, Homecoming and Far From Home, would look like with all these changes. So let's not waste any more time and get right into it. First, I should go over the single biggest change in this whole thing, and it's one that pretty much everyone has said. The Iron Man-Peter relationship in the MCU Spider-Man is deep. It's safe to say that in this world, there wouldn't be a Spider-Man without Tony Stark's contributions. Everything from Spider-Man's villains to his suit was given to him by Tony. In both movies, Homecoming and Far From Home, the central conflict, the villains, are a direct result of Tony Stark. So to remove him from these movies would remove the suit, the villains, as well as the mentor Uncle Ben stuff that went into Peter's character in these movies. Without Tony Stark, we need to do a lot of work to get Peter to where he is by the end of both Homecoming and Far From Home. Next up is Uncle Ben. In the MCU, he doesn't really exist. There's no mention or reference to Uncle Ben at all, except this, which is a blink and you'll miss it nod to Uncle Ben. But that's really all it is. A nod. Ben Parker can be a really fascinating character, but the MCU seems to have an aversion to the problems and experiences that make Spider-Man, Spider-Man. And this brings me to another change. His money troubles. That is to say, he doesn't really have any. Except in this deleted scene from Far From Home that I wish they kept in, where Peter sells his stuff to be able to afford the class trip. And finally, I don't think Spider-Man should have been in Civil War. At least, not in the way he was. I think having our first encounter with this new MCU version of Spider-Man happen in Civil War was a mistake, because we haven't even spent 10 minutes with the Spider-Man, and already he has a suit and is fighting and beating the Avengers. It's hard to feel a strong connection with a character who's already amazing at what he's doing without a strong lead-up or understanding of how he's amazing. Everybody and their grandma knows who Spider-Man is. So, technically, this introduction was fine. We don't need to get to know this character because he's been around for decades, and everybody's already familiar with him. But when reintroducing any character, whether people know them or not, it's always better to introduce them in a strong way and make us care about this character all over again before throwing them into their final form and having them beat the Avengers. And now the hard part. Putting everything together and making the changes fit into Homecoming and Far From Home without completely changing them. And we'll start by removing Iron Man from the equation. No Iron Man, no suit, no villains, no mentor. I want to replace Iron Man with Uncle Ben. I know, big shocker. This will mainly just add the mentor-father-son relationship Peter had with Tony. I'll explain what I want to do with Uncle Ben a little bit later because we need to get our villains situated. All of the villains in Homecoming and Far From Home are villains because they hate Tony Stark, and Peter just kind of gets in between. I'm going to keep the same villains, Vulture and Mysterio, because there's no reason to get rid of them. We just need to change their motivations. For Vulture in Homecoming, I like that he makes his wings with Chitauri tech from the Battle of New York, but instead of him stealing the tech because he's mad that Tony Stark took over the cleanup and fired him, he's just going to be a guy that's fascinated with tech. Adrian Toomes is an electronics engineer who works for Best Fin Salvage. He feels small and worthless because all his life no one's taken him seriously, and even though he has a degree in electronic engineering, everyone refused to hire him for some reason. I'm not really sure it would matter in the context of this movie. While on the job for cleanup after the Battle of New York, he saw all the alien tech and thought about all the stuff he could do with it. Fascinated by this strange technology, he smuggled a truck full and took it home. After hours of testing and examinations, he figures out the potential for a self-flight device and begins work trying to create it. After many failed attempts, he finally creates a successful set of self-flight wings. So impressed and enamored with his creation, he realizes all the power and technology he has access to, and decides he needs more of the Chitauri's tech. He uses his new wings to fly into wherever the tech is being stored and takes it, feeling more powerful than he ever has, with the invention of self-flight and 2 successful heists, he decides to start designing weapons for his new wings, vowing to show all the people who mocked him they were wrong. The inciting incident, what gets Spider-Man and Vulture fighting, is no longer going to be a random weapons sale that Spider-Man intervenes. Adrian Toomes uses his new wings and blasters to attack someone. I don't know who, just someone who wronged him by refusing him a job or something. It doesn't really matter. But the attack is a huge public spectacle, and Spider-Man shows up to stop it. After being humiliated by Spider-Man, who beats him rather quickly, Adrian wants revenge on Spider-Man and makes a new, more powerful set of weapons and wings, which will be the costume and wings he had in the actual Homecoming movie. Mysterio's new origin is more or less going to be one from the comics. Quentin Beck is a special effects artist for movies and stuff, but he'll work on VFX instead of the practical effects from the comics. He gets fed up with the way his career is going and uses his VFX magic to become a beloved hero. Just like the real Far From Home, all the monsters are fake and the movie progresses similarly. Alright, now back to Uncle Ben. I not only want him to be a character, but I want him to be a main character. I want him to be as important as Tony Stark was to Peter, and since we want Homecoming and Far From Home to feel more or less the same tonally and plot-wise, that means Uncle Ben has to survive for a whole movie. I know what you're thinking. If Uncle Ben is alive for the entirety of Homecoming, then how can his death inspire Peter to fight crime? Well, quite simply, he doesn't. Not for the first half of the movie, at least. This isn't going to be an origin story, Homecoming wasn't, so this won't be, but I have a pretty good idea for how to make this work. The first act of this new version of Homecoming will follow Adrian Toomes becoming the Vulture and Peter's new life with his powers, quitting the decathlon and slacking in school to have more time to swing around the city and maybe stopping the occasional purse snatcher. The Peter stuff is pretty much the same as in the actual movie, just with the new Vulture origin over it. In Act 2, the Vulture goes after someone who he felt wronged him, and Spider-Man intervenes and humiliates the Vulture. Vulture builds more powerful wings and weapons and vows revenge on Spider-Man. Uncle Ben will get in the middle of a carjacking and end up in the hospital. This is where we get the "with great power comes great responsibility" speech, and Peter swears to stop people from hurting others and to be a hero. And Act 3 is pretty much exactly the same. Peter goes to Homecoming with Liz, her dad is revealed to be the Vulture, he finds out Peter's Spider-Man, and it ends in a fight on a jet. After the Vulture is defeated, Peter goes to the hospital to check on Uncle Ben, and it's revealed that he's made a full recovery and is going home. But right at the end of the movie, while they're taking Uncle Ben home, they stop at a gas station. Ben goes into the convenience store to get some gum or something and accidentally interrupts a robbery, gets shot, and dies. The post-credit scene can be Peter making his iconic costume. Oh yeah, Peter has his homemade suit for this whole movie. Far From Home will largely be the same, except the Mysterio origin we already talked about, and Peter's going to be sad about Uncle Ben, not Tony Stark, which also means no happy in this movie, but he's easily removable. Just replace his speech about Iron Man with Aunt May making a speech about Ben, and have Nick Fury pick him up in the Netherlands. I really would like to see these versions of these movies, but that will never happen, and I'm just glad that Disney has Spider-Man, kinda. Because even though they aren't great movies about Spider-Man, they're still great movies with Spider-Man.